Well, I'm so excited to welcome Twitter's first couple, the Entsers, Mark and Zoe Entzer, to It's Your Time You're Wasting. Hello, both. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And is that a copy of Generative Learning I noticed perched between you?
It is.
Fantastic. So congratulations on the new book. It's published by John Catt, and it's available now. And if you haven't already got it, you should get it. It's one of the first question I'd like to ask you both is what was it like as husband and wife writing this book together?
Actually, I thought it could be a little bit spiky. I thought there might be some moments where we could have some disagreement. But what we did was we were quite systematic in how we split it up. So we thought about the different areas, generative learning and the work of Logan Fiorella and Richard Meyer is very clear with the 8 strategies. So that was nice and straightforward, and we kind of divided those areas up. And at the beginning, we kind of looked in the introduction and the conclusion and said, which are the areas that we're particularly knowledgeable and passionate about? And then we wrote them, and then we fed into that and kind of went back and forth around it. But actually, where I thought there was going to be perhaps some tensions to arise, there weren't. So that was really good from my perspective, but Mark might be about to say something else.
I think once we spent quite a lot of time walking the dog and kind of discussing what the paper was saying and what its implications were and the kind of the rest of the theory that it linked to. So we spent ages batting it around, and then we just divided it in 2 and said, okay, we've got a common understanding of what this is saying. Now let's divide up the strategies and see what we come up with. Okay, so you each took the lead on 4?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. And it would be interesting for readers to see if they can tell. I could certainly tell at times, Zoe, your voice came through because you use I and referred to English. And I was like, well, that's obviously Zoe. And anything to do with geography, I obviously knew that was to do with you, Mark. But other than that, it seemed a very consistent style. And how much work went into making it that consistent style?
We sat down, we agreed how we wanted to set out each chapter. So we used kind of, common headings throughout, because we wanted this to be a really easy guide for teachers to pick up and use and do something with, reflect on in terms of their own practice and then take it away and do. So we made sure it had that kind of common style. And then I think we spent so long discussing each chapter, going backwards and forwards to each other. I'd write at the table, so we'd write on the sofa, so in the same room. We'd say, what do you think about this? Have you got an idea for this? I'm a bit, stuck on this. Right. And so the chapters kind of evolve together anyway a lot of the time. Right.
I think it's interesting you say that, you can hear my voice and you can hear Mark's voice. But sometimes I would say I could really do with a geography example here for this chapter. So people can play that game. And I know certainly somebody on Twitter over the weekend was throwing that exact idea out about the different writing styles that we may have. And I put that challenge there. Can you spot me? And can you spot Mark when you read the book?
Right. Well, so there's if obviously I'm sure that if anyone can get it absolutely right, get in touch with John Catt and they'll give you a prize.
I'm sure they will.
Indeed.
A mug with our face on or something. You'd think.
Yeah, what a lovely thing to own. Okay, so what the other questions? The other big question about sort of writing of the book is obviously. Well, I would say obviously. To what extent was Tom involved as series editor?
Yeah, that's a good question. Tom, what are you doing? I think he was very good. He had, once the initial ideas were kind of discussed and kind of batting around some ideas, he did give a very good kind of hands-off approach and was very clear this is our book. And for each of the writers in the series, said this needs to be your distinctive book. We've asked you to write it for a reason. And then afterwards, we sent the manuscript. He came out with some suggestions and ideas, which were fantastic, using his kind of experience of writing like this before. We then kind of fed into the final edit. But during the writing process itself, refreshingly hands-off.
But I do think it's fair to say that, he kind of had the parameters, but he allowed us that freedom within there. He wanted our own voices for everybody who was involved in the series to really come through, particularly when it came to practice, because as we know that's with the different subject areas, there's going to be a variety there.
Yeah. And what was it like? At what stage did Oliver get involved? Was he did he provide the drawings afterwards, or did you request things?
So the images we used were ones that he's already produced. So they're things on Ollie Cab's website. He's got a massive resource there for teachers to use and kind of take from. So we selected images there, and then after the manuscript was written, he did the kind of the page layouts, the designs, the covers, and kind of and everything there. But yeah, the images were ones that he had used that we felt illustrated the points we were making.
Yeah, it's definitely worth. He's got the poster, rather like you would recognise from the Rosenshine. He's got that version for the generative learning, so kind of a one-page kind of stop for people to have a look at those different images and some of the key ideas from it, particularly in terms of research base.
Yeah, he's. I mean, obviously, one of the so many. I suppose. I mean, this is right up Oliver's street, isn't it? Because it's the practice of what he does. He summarises, he illustrates, he. I can't remember the others off the top of my head, but he's doing.
The first time I came across generative learning, I think was a tweet from his a few years ago recommending their work. So it's certainly something that I think he'd had an interest in before.
And I think the concept mapping in particular, he's really unpicking that further and exploring that further himself. Right.
Okay. So one of the questions I have for you, 8 strategies, and I love the way that you, right up front, you're really clear about the research base, and you talk about boundary conditions, which is a really nice touch and not one that we're necessarily used to in education. Which, make a question to both of you, which of the 8 techniques is your favourite, if there is such a thing? Which one do you like the most?
Go on.
Self-testing. Absolutely self-testing. But of course, self-testing can be a feature of so many other of the strategies. But we know the power of retrieval practice. We know the power of kind of space practice and all of those things that come with that kind of self-testing. That's definitely something I'm a big fan of and see the power of within the classroom. And that's what it's about. It's actually knowing it's having an impact.
Okay, and so before we get on to Mark and talk about yours, one of the things you talk about in the self-testing chapter is you're a little bit critical of multiple choice questions. Can you say a little bit about that?
I think, like anything, it's how you make sure that you're using them effectively. And I think a really good, well-designed multiple choice question can yield a lot. And actually, I'm quite a convert for them for English. I don't think they have been something that have been used regularly in English. And I know some people think, well, they don't have their place. Actually, I think they do. And I've certainly used them and seen some really interesting and surprising results. And we know that any kind of assessment, that's really important, that you actually see something new that you perhaps didn't know. And so I've used them in various ways. The problem is if you don't actually plan them carefully and there are errors in there, they don't yield that kind of information. And so it's about that careful design. But I think that's true of any kind of assessment that you do.
Is it also, I mean, using them for an assessment, like you say, they work really well, but using them as a generative process, you're using the tool for a slightly the wrong thing, perhaps. They're great for an assessment tool, but are they generating learning? Because the pupil doesn't have to go through the process of attempting to select the right information because it's right there.
They can. They can. Again, if you have a well-designed multiple choice question, they actually have to make that selection, particularly if they're having to decide between 2 very close options on there and they're having to select.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because maybe many people designing multiple choice questions are not thinking about it in terms of generative properties, and so now that you've said it, I almost think that's something that could be made a bit more of, because you raise the caution, and I hadn't really considered that purpose, and it should always be purpose comes first, doesn't it? That what are you trying to achieve? And then put the correct tool in. Okay, so Mark, what's your favourite?
I think mapping for geography is just not just drawing maps, but concept maps, graphic organisers are just an incredibly useful tool. So today my year 12 class were doing kind of a big concept maps around the water cycle and they were able to show then the links between them. They were drawing on prior knowledge about the carbon cycle to show where there was overlap. Because geography is about making sense of the world, and that's what a concept map does. It organises and structures a diverse amount of information. So for geography, I think mapping is a very, very powerful tool, but probably less so in other subjects.
Can I
Go on.
Can I just come back to your point that you made there, David, though, where you said about the purpose? And I think that is absolutely imperative when you're doing this, when you use any of these strategies. And none of these strategies are things that people can go, wow, I didn't realise summarising existed. And, what's this about self-explaining? How do we ever use that? It's the purpose. And that's the big difference with generative learning.
Right.
We can use those things for many want it to actually follow the generative learning purpose and the science of learning that underpins that, then actually we need to kind of select what we're doing and why we're doing it and making sure we're using the right thing at the right time. Concept mapping in English, I really struggle with, but I'm sure there are people out there doing wonderful things with it.
Yeah, and you do make the point, that these things fit better in different subjects than others, and I think that's a really important point to make. What would you say to someone whose only experience of mind mapping is the Tony Buzan's type style of what's different from the generative learning approach?
So with all the generative learning strategies, it's around the SOI model that Richard Meyer came up with. So he said, for learning to be generative, the pupil has to go through the process of selecting information, organising it and integrating it into their prior knowledge. So when you're creating a mind map generatively, you're selecting information from a body and then you're organising it around different categories. So an example of kind of mind mapping done badly, you kind of read some information in a textbook, and as you're reading it, you're just copying out all the words you think are important in a circle around the heading, maybe with some coloured gel pens and some bubble writing and things. And highlighters. That's what you see with bad. Yeah. Whereas if you want to do it generatively, then you're thinking, okay, I'm reading some information on Typhoon Haiyan. How does a geographer approach this information? Well, they want to look at the cause, the effect, and the response. So we'll have a heading cause. Okay, so I'm looking at the causes, and then I want to think about, okay, which of those were physical causes and which things about the event were driven by human behaviour. So now I want to categorise those off. Okay, now let me find the information that's relevant to that. Now what's my next category, and so on. So they're kind of constantly organising that information, and then they're thinking, okay, what else do I know about this topic that I can now add on to my mind map that isn't on the information in front of me, but comes from my long-term memory, that comes from within my existing schema, that I can now try to link this to. So it's a much more structured way of going about it.
And that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because obviously many of your readers will already know about the working memory model. And so what's the big difference between that model and the SOI model that that generative learning is based on?
I wouldn't say that it is a different model, really. I'd say it uses that model. This is a cognitive process. It fits within that body of research. So things like the work on self-testing, mapping, it's always coming back to those ideas. I think it aligns very nicely with things like cognitive load theory. And it fits within that view of the science of learning.
Right. So just to make it clear to people, this is research which is using that really solid base of the working memory model. It's been around for decades now.
Yeah.
And rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, it's riffing off it. It's looking at how to use that and develop it for particular purposes.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. And hopefully that's clear to everyone that what generative learning is. So having written the book and having spent this time with the paper, what would you say are the main ways that this has affected how you might approach the classroom? I mean, I know, Zoe, you're not teaching directly anymore, but you're working with lots of teachers. But Mark, you're still in the thick of it. Has it changed things?
I mean, the reason I would say I was able to write the book, and we were able to write the book, is that we've been using these strategies for a long time anyway. So, Zoe left the classroom in January, just before lockdown. So we were both using generative strategies beforehand in order to write about them. We didn't kind of read about it and then write the book and now try to use them. I think whenever you write something, though, and you immerse yourself in it in the way that you have to when you're writing a book, it's made me much more aware. So like I say, you know, today teaching year 12, I was using that language of select, organise, integrate with the pupils. And I was being much more explicit about how they should be using these strategies themselves in the future. Now, one thing we're all really aware of is that at any point, kids could be sent home, could go into lockdown, and they're going to have to be doing remote learning again. And actually, these generative strategies work beautifully once they're taught for pupils to do on their own without that teacher being in the room with them at the same time, as long as they know how to do them. So it's made me much more aware of needing to teach pupils how to do the strategies.
Right.
And to do them well.
And I think that awareness, sorry, Dad, I think that awareness is where that kind of change comes in, because what it's about sharpening your practice and coming back to that point earlier about the purpose and really thinking about, well, why am I doing this? So, okay, in English, I might have always got them to do a summary, or I might have always got them to kind of explain something to themselves and go through those processes. But it's making sure I'm using them really, really effectively at the right time. And ultimately, if we can get students to use these strategies and be effective in using these strategies, it does build towards independence. And as Mark said, with things as they are at the moment, actually enabling and empowering them to do some of those things on their own is going to be really important as we kind of move on.
Right. One of the things that it's interesting. So in years to come, it will date the book that you're referencing the pandemic, and you're talking about, you know, that as a real something that's going on. But one of the points that you close with, which I think is very much a concern of our times, is that you say for these strategies to be successful, it's critically important that the curriculum is well sequenced so that there are explicit links made to what pupils have already learned, and they are made in a way that allow pupils to make the connections to what they're now learning. And I think that, you know, that I really liked that. And I love the way that you caveat things all the way through, and you're sort of very cautious about all your claims. But I think that the point I think that springs out for me here is that, you know, generative learning and the 8 techniques that you explore, their place is not something that's sort of, you know, you just make, you know, that's just how you plan lessons. It's positioned carefully within the curriculum. Can you say anything else about that?
Yeah, I suppose there's 2 things linked to the curriculum to keep in mind. One is that they only work if pupils have that detailed prior knowledge, because you've got to select information that's new, organise it, and integrate it into what you already know. If you don't know anything, you can't generate new learning. Your generative learning is about seeking patterns based on prior knowledge. It's schema theory. So you have to have a rich curriculum for this to happen. You can't teach these strategies and hope for the best. Like, they have to happen after pupils have been taught. And then I suppose the second curriculum consideration I'd think about is that you have to build in curriculum time to teach these strategies, which to an extent goes against the grain somewhat for me, because I'm very much I just want to teach geography and do nothing but tell people about geography all the time. Listen to me talk about geography, now you go and do some geography. But actually, I do need to say, okay, and the way geographers learn about this is we might use a mind map like this for a reason, or a geographer studying this will have to create summaries like this for this reason, so that next week you can do that yourself without me having to tell you again how to do it. But that takes curriculum time.
And again, that, you know, if you're taking up curriculum time, one of the things that any teacher or leader who's coming across these kind of ideas needs to consider is this what we need for our students? You know, I'm a big fan. You know, we don't do things unless we know that it's going to have an impact on their progress. We don't do something because it seems nice and new and shiny. We do something because we know it's going to have an impact. And it might be that for your students, you don't want to invest curriculum time in making sure that they know how to do self-teaching really effectively, because you don't think that is going to really be what's going to benefit them in the long run. So you need to be selective, and it has to fit within the curriculum, and it has to fit alongside that effective instruction in the first place, because otherwise what do they know about it? If they haven't got the right instruction or materials or information, then they're not going to generate anything from that.
Okay, I mean, those are really good things. Okay, so I've got now sort of a couple of knottier questions which I'm going to throw at you, and so I think there was the other day on Twitter, there was a miniature kerfuffle about learning by teaching. And somebody had referenced Richard Feynman quote, which was that teaching is the best way to learn. And obviously learning by teaching is the seventh of your strategies. So, you know, there's a vested interest in there. And you sort of make the point, and I think you're really honest about this. You say, you know, that it's probably one of the least researched of these areas, and possibly the evidence is less secure here. But can you, or would you like to sort of mount a defence for learning by teaching?
Oh, a defence. I was about to kind of come in and say, well, one of the reasons why the research base isn't perhaps as strong with it is so difficult to actually isolate.
Yes.
Having the impact. So when you ask a student to teach other students or to self-teach something, you are already asking them to go through various potentially generative processes. So isolating, well, it was when they stood and taught or sat and taught somebody else that was what had the impact. That's kind of a difficulty. I think when you want to use or are considering using that kind of teaching strategy, I do think it's about kind of having ideas challenged and having that opportunity to perhaps for them to defend some of their ideas, and that is going to help them to select, maybe reorganize their thinking. So what you're doing, if you are, especially if you can get some really good questioning going on around what they're saying and what they're attempting to teach, you are kind of strengthening their ideas by having that kind of challenge and making sure that they're reorganizing and integrating the correct information. And there are many other reasons why you might do that might not be for a generative reason. There are many reasons, in terms of motivation, in terms of, so again, it's back to selecting it for the right purpose. Do you want to go?
Oh, yeah. It was the one when we were looking through the paper again, kind of when we were discussing it and we were asked to write it. And I went, oh, yeah, teaching's there is a strategy. Do you want to handle this one? It wasn't one that called to me, but looking back at it and looking at Fiorella and Maya's work on it and looking at the research they present, there is a strong case that it can be used to generate learning. I just don't think it's the most effective or efficient way. You know, if you say to someone, I want you to teach the atmospheric circulation model, they're going to have to select information about it. They're going to have to organise it in a way that's going to make sense. Think about what they already know about the topic. And they're going to learn a bit about it, as long as they've got some knowledge already. But it's
quite labour intensive.
It's labour intensive.
If you've got to have the right material.
And then there's the risk that they might generate learning for themselves, but are they also going to pass on misconceptions at the same time because they're not adept at explaining things to other people? They don't have the pedagogical knowledge of how to teach. So although they, as the teacher, might generate learning, what's going to happen in the rest of the class? Are they going to learn from the pupil who's engaged in the action of teaching? That's a risk. So it's not one that I tend to fall back on.
We've done a really rubbish job of defending it.
I was just going to say, go on, David.
Go on, please.
All I was going to say is, with this book, it wasn't ever designed to be a promotion of generative learning. It was an exploration of it as two teachers. This is at two teachers looking at the research, saying lots of it is, they say, boundary conditions, caveats, be careful about this, because that's what teachers should know about this. Teachers shouldn't have things thrust on them saying, this is an amazing piece of research that all of you must do all of this. Go, this is the shiny thing in education, as you say. Yeah. They need to be aware of these issues. And that's what we set out, was our exploration of generative learning, not a sales pitch for generative learning.
And I think the strategy I said earlier that's my favourite is probably the one that I was most deeply critical of when I came to write about it, because I was much more aware that I'd already got, I like it, I can see the benefit of it, it's very visible. The students talk to me about it. And so I was very careful that I was going, and there is a really strong research base there for it as well. But I was quite careful to go through and really unpick it to make sure that I wasn't allowing, my kind of personal view from my classroom experience to actually take away from what was really going on with the research.
It's so hard to do, but I think you do that well. And I think the one thing that occurred to me reading particularly that chapter 7 is where you can maybe get real benefits from learning by teaching is when students are at the revision stage and they're working together to revise, and they're teaching each other at that stage with a real complement of knowledge, and they're not sucking up classroom time. That has real potential.
I think it does, but I think then it's quite interesting, because are you then teaching, or are you just self-explaining with someone else in the room with you?
Well,
and at that point, and Dunlosky points out, self-explaining is an incredibly strong revision. So I think you're right. It's a really strong revision strategy because it's Dunlosky's self-explaining. Yeah,
and maybe the important bit, and you kind of say this yourself in the book, but that maybe students know they're more motivated because they know they're going to be exposed, and that might be, the end of it. I don't know, but it's fascinating to sort of discuss that with you. The other one I found it interesting was the enacting one, which you, forgive me, it's almost like you kind of shrugged your shoulders a little bit and went, oh, I'm not really buying this one so much.
No, how can you say that? That was one that I wrote.
You're giving too much away now for the prize.
I think one of the reasons we were so keen to get Tajinder to write the case study for that one is that she works with very young children, primary age children, in which enacting is a really good strategy. For those children who still struggle with abstract ideas, who struggle to move from concrete to abstract, enacting is brilliant. And she explains really clearly how she would use enacting in the classroom to help people to remember stories, how you might use enacting using counters in maths.
Yeah.
That's where enacting has a place.
The gestures in phonics teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And we use it all the time. The example that I gave at the start for if someone gives you directions in a car and you're trying to remember, and you go, okay, so I go left, then I go right, then I go, you do enacting because it helps you to remember that information for a short time. So it's a really useful strategy in a range of very context-specific occasions. And that's what I think, I wanted to make clear, was that's when it's useful. What I didn't want to do was write it going, I have to write about enacting now, so I'm going to sell this thing that I want to see in classrooms, because I don't want to be that person who in 10 years becomes a learning myth. And, the ENTS has said everyone has to do enacting, and we were introduced in CPD, and now we all have to do little hand signals whenever we're teaching.
I think the point you're making there with the early years, and these are really important considerations. What phase are those students at, not just in terms of their age, but also in terms of their development in the understanding of that particular topic. And that's going to be so important when you're selecting which strategy you want to use in relation to that. And it could be that there are examples where you want to use that enacting with older students, but it's got a much stronger evidence base with using it with much younger students.
Right. Okay. So another bit of a tricky question. Rosenshine's Principles in Action, Generative Learning in Action, which would win in a fight?
Generative learning would easily win. One, it's a bigger book.
That's true. That is very true.
It is a significantly larger book, so it's got weight on its side, which
and value for money.
It's more value for money. Right. The reason I think it'd win in a fight is, I like this question, is because it punches last. I've got a metaphor here. I've got an analogy. I'm not afraid to use it. All right, buckle in. So, Rosenshine comes first. The principles of instruction come first, because you have to have those principles of instruction so that pupils have some knowledge with which to generate learning from. So you have to have that. But generative learning has the last punch, because that's then what they do at the end to secure what they've heard. So, I'm a huge fan of explicit instruction. But after that, you say to the kids, okay, now you need to what? Well, a strategy from generative learning is what you then do. You do a mind map, you write a summary, you self-test. So this is the thing that they then do to generate learning from the instruction they've received.
Okay, great. Okay.
Have you asked Tom that question yet?
No, I haven't. Martin did the interview with Tom, so he's a bit more graceful, I think, as an interviewer. So, without you can name names if you want to, but was there? And you had a contributor and contributors for each of the chapters. Was there anyone who was tricky to work with? Anyone who did your head in, messed you around?
No, they were amazing.
They really
Every one of them.
Yeah.
We rather, sometimes you see people kind of putting out calls for, we're writing a book, anyone wants to contribute a case study for it, but we really wanted to select people for particular chapters because we knew they had something to say. They'd either written a bit about it or they'd said something on a tweet which then explored in the conversation, or so they were very deliberately chosen. And everyone just immediately jumped at the chance to do it. They turned things around quickly. They were amazing.
Some need more confidence in themselves, but if they have to be watching, yeah, because they're all brilliant. But you know,
I completely lost what you said. Then could you just say that again?
I was just saying that there's someone amongst them who needs to be a bit more confident in themselves because they were absolutely brilliant. But they weren't sure why we were asking them, I suppose.
I think you can say who they are. It's nice. Tell
no, they were brilliant. But yeah. I think I think teachers generally need to have more confidence to get their voices out there. It's the reason I think why we write so much is because we want teachers to be heard. And so we're going to keep on shouting until they are.
Well, that's a really interesting point. So in last week's book review, I talked to Mary Myatt, and she was saying that we're in a golden age in her view, that the range of material available for teachers, the diversity of voices, teacher voices that are being published is unprecedented. And obviously, you know, you're part of that, and bringing your contributors in is hopefully a step in them developing their voices further.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, definitely.
But we need more of it because we do get a lot of teacher voices now. That there are more, but they can still easily get swamped. That there's still a huge. And I don't just mean kind of necessarily by teachers who are in the classroom right this minute, came out of a 5-period day to day, but people who have been teaching for years, who are still in education, who are still immersed in that world on a day-to-day basis, and who still have skin in the game. They're the ones who know what works in the classroom. They're the ones who can put it into different contexts, and they understand what it's like on the ground. And I think we still, in a kind of the national voice, is still typically dominated by people who aren't there and who have forgotten what it was like, or who were never there in the first place. People who've never set foot in a classroom, who are still dominating what they think teachers should do. Lord Adonis over lockdown with his, this is how teachers should handle remote learning.
Yes, I seem to remember.
Yeah, him wading in. But yeah, and there's endless, commentators in newspapers and things who just don't have a clue of the day-to-day reality of teaching. Right. And we need to hear more from teachers.
Yeah.
So, Zoe, this is your first publication. Obviously, Mark's written for you. You've let him write a few things about you, but you're going to write another book together. Can you tell us anything about what's to come?
Well, we're having a look at the curriculum for CPD, and we're working on that again together. I have a few various kind of publications of my own, but much smaller scale articles.
Yeah. Sorry,
that kind of thing. But yes, we're working together on the CPD one, and that's really exciting. Sorry?
It's not put you off working together?
No, strangely it hasn't. When we had the idea about the CPD way back, kind of probably Christmas last year. My last role in school was developing CPD and TNL across the school, and we talked a lot about how we could produce something which would support people to kind of draw on the best things that we can do in order to develop teachers. And that was the plan. And then generative learning came up. Poor Mark had to put his book on hold that he was working on. We put that one on hold. But hopefully, all being well, that should be arriving after Christmas.
Great. Okay, well, that's something for us all to look forward to. And so, final thought, both of you. Can you give us one headline reason why people should get this book?
I'd say that the main reason is that we need pupils who know how to study effectively, and this will give them those skills.
Great. Zoe?
Oh, that's a tough one.
You don't like the headlines,
I don't like the headline. Right, I'm an English teacher. I can talk for hours, but not something really punchy.
Put it in a tweet.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks both of you so much for coming on. It's your time you're wasting, and we hope you'll come back when your next book comes out. So thanks very much for now, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.